Welcome, everybody. This lecture is on beekeeping equipment, tools of the trade. Just like every trade, there are tools you need to be familiar with to appropriately keep bees, keep them safe, and to keep you safe. And what we're going to discuss today is all of the equipment that we use in beekeeping so that you can get familiar with what this equipment is and how to properly use it. So we're going to start with the three basic pieces of beekeeping equipment. You know, when I started my beekeeping career back in California in the mid 2000s, it was really interesting to kind of get familiar with a lot of these pieces of equipment. And my mentor had this mantra that we would say when we went out to the bee yard is, what do you need? You need your hive tool, your smoker, and your veil. And those are the three basic pieces of equipment that you as a beekeeper are going to use to manage your bees. The hive tool itself, we're going to jump into that here and we'll go through each one of these individually, but the hive tool itself is what we use to work a beehive. It's how you're going to break beehives apart. So those boxes will get stuck with propolis and you have to break those propolis seals apart. It's also how we work the inside of the hive to pull the frames out, inspect them, and to put the frames back in and space them appropriately. And there's several different styles of hive tools out there, and it really is a personal preference. There's no right or wrong answer to the type of hive tool that you're going to use. And the likelihood is that over the years, you're going to go through several different types until you find that one you really like. Now, one thing I will tell you right at the forefront is you're going to want to buy a couple of these. Usually they're pretty inexpensive, around 10 bucks, maybe 15 bucks. So not very expensive, but the reason you want to have a couple of these on hand is because one, it's a critical tool to work your bees, but two, you are invariably going to drop one of these on the ground. It's going to get hidden in grass and you're not going to be able to find it. So you want to make sure you have a backup just in case that does happen. And it always happens. I've had it happen many years. And usually when spring thaw happens and the ground's bare, I find hive tools out in my bee yard. So just make sure that you have a couple of those in hand. So I'm going to talk to you about three styles of hive tools, probably the most popular three styles that are out there. So the one that you see here on the far left, this is what we call the standard hive tool. This is kind of like the industry standard when it comes to hive tools. You have a sharp end at the metal end down here. That's a sharp end. That's what you use to break those propolis seals apart as you're opening up your beehive. And then at the back end, it's got this curved end that you see here. That curved end is what we use to break the frames apart. Those frames are glued together with propolis as well. It's how we break those frames apart. We actually put that hook part right in between two frames and turn it. And that leverage allows us to break those seals apart without damaging the frames. Now, the other piece that you see here is you see this little notch, that hole that's in there. That's for pulling nails. So, a lot of equipment will have nails on it. You have all of your boxes that are kept together with nails. Sometimes those nails over years will work themselves loose, and this is a way to pop those nails out so that a lot of times, your veil will get hung up on them. You want to make sure that you're not, snagging things, tearing things open. Any opening in a bee veil is an opening for bees to get in. So that's what we have on that other end. So that's the standard tool. The second tool that you see here in the middle, that is known as the J-hook tool. And this is actually my preferred hive tool. I've used a lot of these over the last 15 years of beekeeping, and I really like the J-hook tool. And the reason that I really like that is, some of the features that it has. So at the front of the blade, you see here, it has a sharp blade, just like the standard hive tool. That's what we use to break those propolis seals apart. But then when it comes to breaking the frames apart after we get the box open and breaking those propolis seals between the frames, you can see in this picture here, that's the J-hook that I'm using there. What I'm doing is I'm going to end up putting that front end of the blade, you see right here, how that blade has that little shelf to it. You put those in between the frames like you would that back hook on the standard tool, and you turn it, again, using leverage to break those propolis seals apart. The last thing you want to do is use those sharp tools to dig in between the two frames where they meet and try to break it there. These components on these hive tools are designed this way so that you don't have to do that, because you cause damage to your frames when you try to break. And here, let me show you. On this box here, you have these frames where they touch one another at this point, and you have gaps that are created because of these two touch points. You do not want to try and break those apart, because what you'll end up doing is you'll end up breaking the wood on those frames. So we put the hive tool in between the frames at the edge, kind of where you see me starting to position my hand in the picture, and you turn it. The other thing that I really love about the J-hook tool is that the back end of it has the J-hook. And the J-hook is what we use to put in between frames to lift the frames out. This is a feature the standard hive tool does not have that allows you to help you lift the frames out. And what you do is you hook that J underneath the rabbet end of the frame, and you essentially rest the little ledge on the frame next to it, and you use that leverage to push the frame up. It makes it much easier for getting the frames out. So one of the features I really love about that hive tool, and I've been using this hive tool for over a decade now. It is, like I said, it is my preferred hive tool. The last one that you see here is kind of a combination of the two, and that's why I have it on here. Now, there's lots of other styles of hive tools. This is not all that's out there, but these are the main ones in the industry. This one is known as the Kent Williams hive tool, and I've heard lots of people refer to this as the Cadillac of hive tools. Well, the reason they call it the Cadillac of hive tools is it incorporates both of the technologies from the standard hive tool and the J-hook hive tool into one hive tool, and a lot of people really like that. It is a little more expensive. Usually this is about $20, but you do get all the features of the two other hive tools. And if that's something that you're looking for, this might be an option for you. The next thing that we're going to look at is the smoker. Now, the smoker is a really critical piece of beekeeping equipment and is something that beekeepers have been using since ancient Egypt. Smoke was very early recognized as something that could be utilized by beekeepers to, let's say, calm the temperament of bees. Now, there is a saying out in the beekeeping industry that I do not like, and that is that smoke calms the bees. Smoke does not calm the bees. Smoke calms the bees from our perspective because the bees become less aggressive towards us when smoke is introduced. It's why we use smoke. And one of the things I want to caution you about is you do not want to overuse smoke. Using too much smoke is a bad thing. You want to use smoke only when it's necessary. So this picture that you see here of me is something showing you that you should not do. And that is, and I see a lot of folks do this, is smoke the entrance of the hive before they ever open it. I do not advocate for that approach to bees because what is happening, folks that do that generally think that, oh, I'm calming my bees down before I get into them. You're not calming your bees down. You're calming their response to you. But what's happening from the bees' perspective when smoke is introduced? So when you get into a hive and a hive starts to get testy, what's happening is that something has happened to cue those bees up and they start sending off alarm pheromone. And once alarm pheromone starts to come out into the air, bees notice that pheromone and will start attacking individuals that are around the hive because it's seen as an intrusion. You have caused the bees to get stressed and they have sent out this alarm pheromone and they will start attacking you. Now, when we introduce smoke into those situations, what it does is it reduces the concentration of alarm pheromone. So it makes it harder, or it makes it less prevalent in the environment. The other thing that it does is it clogs the antennae. On the antennae, there are these things called chemical receptors. We call them chemoreceptors. And volatile chemicals flying around in the air, this is how bees communicate with one another. This is how they interpret their environment. It's pretty much how insects talk to one another, is through these chemoreceptors. And so what's happening, that's where the pheromones are being interpreted. And so what's happening with smoke is we're clogging those chemoreceptors with smoke particles, so it makes it harder for the bees to actually receive the alarm pheromone and interpret it. The other thing that's happening from the bees' perspective is this is a stress response when smoke is introduced. And so what bees do is they start to get ready to evacuate the hive because essentially it's like a forest fire coming to the hive. And so what we want to make sure that we're aware of is that, again, this is a stress response. So when they get hit with that smoke, the bees will dive down into the hive. They will gorge themselves on honey to get ready for evacuation. Now, that makes it a little more difficult for them to sting because their honey stomach enlarges in that abdomen, and it makes that small abdomen get a little bit bigger. So it makes it a little more difficult for them to sting you. So those are the things that make it seem like they're calming down from our perspective. But the actuality is that smoke introduced to a bee colony induces a stress response in the bees, which is why we don't want to overuse smoke. You only use smoke when absolutely necessary. And just to give you an idea of what I mean by not using too much smoke, there will be many times where I will go through 50 beehives and maybe touch a smoker twice. That's what I mean. It's only if the bees are getting testy. And if you're working bees in the middle of the season when they're not very testy, usually towards the fall, they get very testy because they're protecting honey reserves from robbers. During the middle of the season, you may not need to use a smoker at all. And I want you to understand that it is, although it is a critical piece of equipment, when bees start getting testy, we use it to calm them from our perspective. But you don't want to use too much smoke. It is a stress response, like I said. Our veil. So veils, again, personal preference. There's lots of styles out there available. And over the years, you're probably going to go through several different styles. And you may use different styles during different parts of the season. So let's show you what a couple of the standard styles are. This is my wife, Lacey, here. She's filling a beehive with feed. And you can see she's just using a face veil. That's all she's using during that time. Now, in the middle of the season, July, August, July and early August here in the UP in northern Michigan, that's generally when you can work these bees with just a veil. There's so much resource in the landscape that they're not really concerned about protecting honey, and so they're not very defensive in nature. As we move later on in the season, and we get into, say, late August, early September, October, when robbing becomes a big activity, there's no resources in the landscape, bees are protecting everything they've got, and so they get very testy. That might be a time to use something like the veil you see me pictured in here in the middle. And this is a jacket veil, so it covers my chest, it covers my stomach, it covers my face. And that's a great alternative when bees are getting a little more antsy, is to have a little more protection. Now, many of you are probably brand new to beekeeping, or maybe only have a few years of experience. And what I do want to instill upon you is that when you get started in beekeeping, PPE, your personal protective equipment, these veils, is something that you need to be comfortable with. If you are scared of getting stung, that means that you're not going to be calm and moving slowly in a beehive. And so you want to have the most protection that you can get that you feel comfortable with. You do not want to be scared of getting stung, because it's going to make beekeeping just not very fun. And you're going to rush through hives because you're afraid of getting stung, and that's bad for the bees. So you need to be comfortable. And that's what I mean by a personal preference. You have to be comfortable in this veil to go out and work venomous insects without getting scared. And so if you need a full coverall and veil when you first get started, that's perfectly okay. You need to consider that. And if that's where you need to be, that's where you need to be. As you get more familiar, you'll probably get out of the coveralls, because I'll tell you what, during July and August, when you're in these coveralls working beehives, they are hot as can be. But if that's what makes you comfortable, that's the way you should go. Now, the other thing that I would say is that within even these styles, there's different styles within styles. And the different styles are that we now have ventilated jackets and canvas jackets. So like what you see pictured here, these are all canvas material on the two right images that you see here. But there also are more ventilated fabrics that are made into beekeeping veils. And they're typically multi-layered fabrics, but they're open, so it allows for a lot of ventilation, which is really nice. If you want a full coverall setup with the ventilation, that's a really nice alternative. They're a little more expensive, but it is something that you can get full protection and then not be so hot either. The nice thing about the full coveralls, and my wife likes to wear full coveralls sometimes, because she may wear just a bathing suit under it. So, something like that might be something right up your alley. But again, all of this PPE is personal preference. So make sure that you are comfortable. Gloves are another really big part of beekeeping. Now, there are 3 stages of glove wearing in beekeeping, and they start here from left to right in these images. You see on the left, I have a student of mine that's wearing full leather gloves. So if you are just getting started in beekeeping, these are beekeeping gloves. These are what all the supply stores sell, and this is what's widely used in the industry. Even in the commercial industry, folks use these. But the leather gloves, although they do offer maximum protection, they offer the least amount of dexterity in all of these options. And the thing that you're going to notice as you get into your beekeeping career is that you need to be able to feel things when you're working these hives. Working slow, working methodical, being gentle with your bees is how I teach people to be good beekeepers. And it's easy on the bees, and it's easy on us when the bees are not being beat up. And again, if you feel like you're a little intimidated by bees and getting stung in the hands, the leather gloves are probably a good option for you, but what you're going to notice as you work with them is that they're clunky. They're really big and clunky. And generally this, sizing is not always exact because they're not tight fitting. So, some folks will have gloves that just are a little too big for them and they don't work very well. Again, personal preference, but as you're getting started, if that's where you need to be to feel fully protected and comfortable, that's what you should go with. As you move through your beekeeping career and get more comfortable with bees, I would highly encourage you to get away from leather gloves. And there's a few reasons for that. So one is the dexterity, but the second reason for that really is that leather gloves, when you purchase a pair of leather beekeeping gloves, it's generally the only pair of gloves you buy. And you use those beekeeping gloves week after week, month after month, year after year, and they get all sorts of stuff on them as you're working beehives. What can happen is if you interact with a diseased beehive, meaning that there's a pathogen in the beehive, like American foul brood or European foul brood, you can actually transfer the spores of those pathogens through gloves. And so those gloves become reservoirs for pathogens over time. And most people don't replace those leather gloves on a regular basis. So that's something you need to be aware of, is that you're going to have less dexterity and they become reservoirs for disease over time. Something very important to consider, because biosecurity is going to be a big part of your beekeeping endeavor as you're getting into bees. The next option that you see here in the middle is nitrile gloves. And this is what I use all the time. Now, nitrile gloves do not protect you from stings. Bees will still sting through beekeeping through nitrile gloves, but they don't recognize the surface as skin. So they don't readily sting through it, but they will sting through it. If you crush a bee or something like that, you will get stung through it. The nice thing about the nitrile gloves is it's kind of like a medium between not wearing gloves and wearing the leather gloves. You get a little bit of protection through the nitrile surface. You have maximum dexterity because they're tight. But the other really beautiful thing, and the thing I love the most about nitrile gloves, is if I have a hive that has a disease and I'm working that hive, as soon as I'm done with it, I can take those gloves off, throw them away, and put a fresh pair of gloves on, and I am not transferring disease anywhere. It is the best feature about disposable nitrile gloves, is the ability to make sure you are not transferring pathogens from one hive to the next. Now, the last picture you see here of my hand here is working gloveless. Now, that is an option. Now, you don't have the options to take off your gloves if you interact with a diseased hive, but you can disinfect your hands if you do interact with a diseased hive. Now, you will get stung occasionally with going gloveless. That's just part of beekeeping. You're going to get stung. It's just part of the industry. But those of us who work gloveless, and I've worked gloveless for the better part of a decade in many situations, if I don't have nitrile gloves around, or if I'm just going into one hive, I may just not wear gloves at all. But the thing is that if you're working a bunch of hives, you get sticky over time. It's, you're working with bees and honey and wax and propolis. So, your hands get very dirty over time. You could get, stung up in the hand a little bit, which is, stings are not a big deal. The only place they're a real big deal is the face. Nobody likes getting stung in the face. I've been stung in the eye. I've been stung in the ear. I've been stung up the nose, around the mouth. All of them are terrible places to get stung, but getting stung in the hands is really not a big deal. So if you wanted to go gloveless, you absolutely can. All right, so that's the personal protective equipment. Now we're going to jump into the modern beehive. Now, the modern beehive, as it stands today, what you are going to be instructed on in this course is the Langstroth hive, which is the industry standard in North America. There's lots of other varieties of hives out there. There's long hives. There are flow hives. There's all these, Ware hives, top bar hives, all these different hive styles. But what I can tell you from instructing in beekeeping for more than 10 years is that in northern climates, in the UP and northern Michigan, this is the best hive to use because it is oriented in a fashion that makes winter success much easier than other beehives. And the reason for that is the hive is arranged in a vertical fashion instead of a horizontal fashion. And you can see the beehives pictured here in the middle. These are modern Langstroth hives. The Langstroth hive essentially puts the food resources above the bees, and bees overwinter. Their behavior is to move up over the course of the winter, feeding on reserves. Think of a tree. Trees, tend to be long cylinders that bees are in when they find a knot hole in a tree, and the food is always arranged vertically. It's not arranged horizontally. So horizontal hives, although they are great adaptive equipment for people with disabilities that may not be able to lift hives, they are not suitable hives to overwinter at high rates in northern climates. You will struggle year after year because the food is arranged on the outside of the hive, outside of the cluster of bees that is overwintering, and bees generally do not move horizontally to get to food. So that's why the Langstroth hive is so great. If you lived in Florida, California, Alabama, a horizontal hive is perfectly fine. It will do just fine down there. We're in the UP in northern Michigan. The climate is very different, and those hives just do not perform very well up here. So that's why we're going to be instructing on the Langstroth hive. Now, a little bit of history about Langstroth. Lorenzo Langstroth in 1851 was beekeeping, and he noticed a few major things about bees that have revolutionized the beekeeping industry. This hive design that he came up with, up until that point, this was the most revolutionary thing that happened in beekeeping in about 4,000 years. That's how important this hive was to our industry. And the reason for it is twofold. There are two aspects of this hive that no other beehive before this ever observed and ever incorporated into its design. The first piece of that design is what we call bee space. Bee space is a space of about 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch. It's a space large enough for two bees to pass one another in the colony without colliding. And if you give bees a large space to work in, they will always create a situation where there are cavities where they're moving through that incorporate bee space. And Langstroth noticed this and noted it and actually incorporated it into the hive design. So when we look at this top view of these frames are spaced appropriately with bee space that's built into the design. And that was absolutely revolutionary at the time. Before Langstroth, the way that people harvested honey was they would kill the hive, remove all the wax and honey, and crush it down. That is an unsustainable way to keep bees, especially in our era when we have issues with even keeping bees alive. And so what we ended up getting here was we got this opportunity to not only incorporate bee space, but the second aspect of this colony is it has removable frames. So that was revolutionary at the time and still is to this day, because now we can work the hive in a modular fashion. We don't have to, just look at a big hive and a whole bunch of wax and try to figure out what's going on. Instead, we can take these out frame by frame, inspect each frame individually, and then replace it. Those removable frames and that ability to modularly work through a beehive, game changer. And like I said, the biggest revolution in the beekeeping industry in 4,000 years up to that point. And to this day, every hive style out there incorporates bee space. There is no hive style, well, with the exception of frameless colonies, a lot of people that do top bar and stuff like that, the top bars do not incorporate bee space because they're always kind of just making wax as they want. The frames themselves are spaced with bee space, but there can be some wonky stuff that happens in foundationless colonies. And we'll talk about foundation in here in just a minute. But in 1852, Lorenzo Langstroth patented this design. Now, the Langstroth hive he patented is not what we see here today. It's a little bit different. His hive had the removable frames, but it had one single box that basically everything was contained in. And over the years, designers and beekeepers started to find the need to have separate boxes. And so that's why we have the separate box design today. But revolutionary, game changer in our industry, and has been since 1852. All right, so let's go through the components of the modern day Langstroth hive. And we're going to start at the bottom and work our way through the top. And I'm going to go through every one of these components with you and what they do, because you need to know not only how they work and what they're for, but you're going to need to know what you need to buy, right? So let's talk about that. All right, so the first part of this hive that you see here is actually not part of the hive at all, but what we put the hive on. and that's called a hive stand. Now, hive stands come in all sorts of varieties. You see three different varieties here in these images. The one at the bottom right, this one here, that is something you can make or you can purchase. It's just made of wood. You see one here to the left has pavers and then a wooden kind of a stand that goes on top of that. And then you also have something as simple as the top, which is basically just a pallet. And that's what commercial beekeepers tend to keep their bees on. The reason that we use a hive stand is for a couple different reasons. So number one, all of your beekeeping equipment is, for the most part, unless you're using polyurethane hives, but most hives are going to be wooden. And if you were to set your hive right on the ground, that woodenware will absorb moisture from the ground and will rot very quickly. So by elevating our hive stand and having our beehives, our bee equipment on top of that, we are eliminating that direct interaction with the ground, which is very important. So that's one. We're preserving the wood so that our equipment will last for many years. And woodenware should last for a long time. I have some woodenware that's 7, 8, 10 years old and still in totally usable condition because you take care of your equipment and it's not in direct contact with moisture. The other piece of this is pests. So many small pests will interact with bee colonies, primarily mice. Mice will get into colonies, they'll wreak a bunch of havoc, they foul up your wax, they poop all over everything, and essentially you just got to discard all of the equipment because it's got a bunch of fecal matter and urine all over your equipment. Terrible thing to happen. If we elevate the hive a little bit, it gives those mice less ability to get into the hive. Secondarily, if you live in an area that has a lot of other predators of honeybees, like, and I'm talking about smaller stuff, raccoons and skunks are two major ones. Now, raccoons and skunks, the way that they predate on bees is they come up to the front of the hive and they scratch on the hive. And what it does is it causes the bees to get kind of queued up. And so they start coming out to see what's going on. And then the individual raccoon or skunk just sits there and just plucks them away as they're coming out and feeds on them. So if you're in an area that has high skunk or raccoon pressure, a lot of times in urban areas, this is a big problem. You can actually elevate those stands even higher so that those pests cannot get into your bees as well. So it serves to protect your bees from pests, but also from rot, from moisture. All right, so the next piece of this is the bottom board. And the bottom board is the bottommost piece of the bee colony. It's where you set all your boxes on. It's where the bees come in and out of the colony, right through the front. Now, there are a couple different bottom boards available in the industry, and we're going to talk about both of those. And those are the solid bottom board, which you see pictured on top, and the screened bottom board, which you see pictured on the bottom. Now, the solid bottom board is pretty self-explanatory. It works just fine. Bees don't really care which bottom board you put on them. They will do just fine with either one of them, even in cold climates like the UP. About half of my apiary is on screened bottom boards, and some of them don't even have the entrance in them. They overwinter just fine. The cold is not what's going to kill your bees. So make sure you understand that you can use either one of these. Some people get really, really crazy about making sure that their hives are, airtight, essentially, when they go into winter. Most of those people lose their bees year after year. Bees do not need to be in an airtight, warm situation. They need to have certain things going on for winter. And mainly those are enough food and mites are under control. But we're going to cover that all in detail as we get further into the course. But essentially what you want to look at here is with the screen bottom board is the screen bottom board really is an artifact of when we started looking at new ways to manage varroa mites. So varroa mites, and you'll hear me talk about this all the time. Varroa mites are the #1 cause of honeybee decline globally. It is a global parasitic pest that not only compromises some of the organ functions of honeybees, but also transmits well over 20 different viruses that are fatal to honeybees. And so varroa mite is a major part of being a beekeeper. And in fact, it's one of the main parts of being a beekeeper is making sure that your mites are in check all season long. And why we came out with screen bottom boards in the industry is after mites were introduced in the United States, and here in Michigan, it was 1987. When these were introduced in the United States, we as beekeepers and as researchers tried to figure out ways to control them. And one of the things that folks came up with was this screen bottom board. And the idea is that mites will be on bees, they will fall off bees at some point, and they'll go through the screen and they won't be able to find their way back up in the hive. And that just never worked. It never worked as that tool. And so over the years, the manufacturers of these screen bottom boards have kind of changed the way that they advertise them. So now it's a lot of times you'll see them advertised as an integrated pest management board or an IPM board. And what you use an IPM board is essentially in a screen bottom board is essentially you have a sticky board that is the insert that you see here through the screen, that white piece. It's sticky. And essentially you can put it in there and you can use it for monitoring. More than anything, it's just a monitoring device to see if you have mites in there. Some people like to just pull it out and see if there's mites on there. Great. But it is not a diagnostic tool. It is not an appropriate way to get mite counts off of your colony. It does not work for that. And I want to be real clear about that. If you think you're going to buy a screen bottom board and get away with not doing mite checks in its place, that's not the case. The only thing this is really useful for is if you have this screen bottom board on and you do a mite treatment, what it gives you an indication of is mite drop. So you see a bunch of mites dead on the bottom board. Sure, my treatment probably worked pretty well. That's essentially all you can get from it. And the reason is because when we do mite counts, and I'll talk about how we do that in detail here in future lectures, but when we do mite counts, we have to standardize the number of bees. And by just having a bunch of mites falling on your bottom board insert here with a screen bottom board, you have no idea how many bees are in your colony. And so there's no way to correlate the number of bees to the number of mites to get a percentage of infectivity, which is what we do with the other tests that we use to monitor for mites. So it's really only useful to see mite drop, which is not a diagnostic tool. It's just mainly to make you feel better about your mite treatment and the fact that it probably was effective. So keep that in mind. The bottom board also is going to have an entrance reducer. Now, the entrance reducer is a really important piece of equipment because it allows us to control the size of the entrance to the colony. Now, why is that important? Well, in the beginning of the season, when you have a smaller colony, maybe you just installed a package or a nuke, that colony is very vulnerable to stronger colonies. Bigger colonies will rob out smaller colonies when resources are limited. And in the spring, a lot of times we're in a kind of a situation here in the UP and Northern Michigan where bees are flying, but there's not a ton of resources out in the landscape. And so what happens is that larger colonies will start seeking out small, vulnerable colonies and just steal everything in them. And so what the entrance reducer allows you to do is it allows you to close down that entrance. So you see two different styles, two different sizes here. You have the small entrance and then the medium entrance, or you could just have them just not in at all. And typically during July, August, when we're in the mid part of the season, when there's a big honey flow going on, maybe late June, you're not going to have one of these in your colony because you're just going to have bees coming in and out, and resources are not limited. So robbing is not a big problem. But in the beginning of the season, say early June, late May, when you're getting the colony established, you may have it on the medium size here. And what it does is it allows for your guard bees to have a smaller defensive area. So they don't have to defend such a large opening. And so they can defend that more appropriately from robbers. If you have a real small colony, maybe the smallest entrance is what you want to use. Again, it's a smaller defensive area that they have to defend. And so it's really based on the size of your colony. Now, conversely, as we get into the late part of the season, you're going to start incorporating this onto all of your colonies, because as we get in the wind down of the season, September, October, resources are vanishing in the landscape. Goldenrod's probably done by then. You're going to need to protect your colony because every bee colony that's in the area is going to be looking for food. And this is when robbing season happens. So bees are constantly looking out for other colonies that they can rob out of resources. And so you will use this entrance reducer to control, again, that defensive area that bees have to defend so that you don't have issues. Now, for example, if you were to come out to a colony and it was being robbed, you just had a swarm, a huge bunch of bees trying to get into your colony. It's very obvious when you see it. You can, if you don't have an entrance reducer on, you can pop one of those in while robbing is happening and really help that colony out. So it's a very useful tool. The next piece of equipment that we're getting to is hive bodies. Now, there are three different sizes of hive bodies available as far as height is concerned. And there are two different sizes of hive bodies related to the numbers of frames that they hold. So we have 10 frame hive bodies and 8 frame hive bodies. I'll tell you the difference between the two. It's 2 frames. Not to be funny, but it's only essentially an 8-frame hive body is exactly the same as a 10-frame hive body. It just has 2 less frames, so it's a little smaller. The reason that a lot of folks use 8-frame, and I have 8-frame and 10-frame in our apiary, the reason why most people use 8-frame equipment is because of lifting restrictions. If you have a back injury, bad knees, something like that, where lifting heavy boxes and twisting is going to hurt you, by using an 8-frame piece of equipment, you're eliminating a lot of weight by 2 frames. Now, in a deep orientation, like you see here, when you have a deep frame that's full of honey, it can weigh up to about 10 pounds. So by eliminating 2 frames, you can eliminate up to 20 pounds of lifting on your part. Just so you know, for your own edification, a deep hive body full of honey, about 100 pounds. A lot of weight. So you're going to be lifting a lot of weight. And if you have lifting restrictions, I'm one of those individuals. I'm a disabled veteran. I have a knee, ankle, back injury, and it limits my ability to lift heavy stuff. And so I generally like the 8-frame equipment. And so if that's you, maybe that's the way you want to go. But it's personal choice here. The bees don't care either way, and they will overwinter just fine in both of them. I can tell you from experience that will work just fine. So it's personal preference. Now, as far as the height is concerned, the 2 hive bodies that you see pictured here are deep hive bodies. The traditional arrangement for a Langstroth hive is to use 2 deep hive bodies for your brood chamber at the bottom, and then medium hive bodies for your what we call honey supers, where honey is being stored. The bees do not care what size hive body you use. You could use all mediums. And for me, with my disabilities, we use mostly all mediums. Now, the difference in size, deep frames or deep boxes are 9 5/8 inch deep. Medium are 6 5/8. And then we also have a third option, which most people only use for comb honey production, and those are called shallows, which are 5 11/16. So differing sizes. Now, the smaller the box, the less the weight. But the smaller the box, the more boxes you need for each hive. Because in this situation, if you replace medium hive bodies in the place of deep hive bodies in your brood chamber, you're going to need 3 to 4 mediums to make up that same amount of space as those deep hive bodies. So if you want to go with lighter options, you just need more equipment. But the bees don't care. But like I said, the traditional setup is 2 deep hive bodies for the brood chamber and honey supers in the medium style, which is the 6 5/8. The hive bodies themselves are basically just a place where frames are put in. And these hive bodies, like you see pictured here, essentially you're going to work them from the outsides in, and that's how you work those hive bodies. And we'll talk about how you do inspections and hive handling in a later lecture. But that's where your frames are going to be housed. So whether you want to go with medium hive bodies that are 8 or 10 frame, or deep hive bodies that are 8 or 10 frame for your brood chamber, that is entirely up to you. All right, so the next piece of this, that's our brood chamber. The next piece of this, and this is an optional piece of equipment, is a queen excluder. Now, a queen excluder is essentially what you see here. It's just a metal grate or a plastic grate. And those slits are large enough so that worker bees can move through, but small enough so that your queen can't get through. And so what it does is it essentially sequesters her to the brood chamber. Now, a lot of people like that because you don't get any comb up in your top boxes. You just get honey. But some people don't use them at all. I'm one of those folks. I do not use queen excluders at all. The only time I use queen excluders is for some queen rearing operations. I use them for that. But other than that, I do not use queen excluders. And the reason for that is that bees, the queen will, in general, it's not always a hard and fast rule. It's in general, I'd say like 90% of the time. Your queen is only going to create a brood pattern in those brood boxes that's about the depth of 2 basketballs, which is essentially kind of the same space as those 2 deep hive bodies. It's why that has been kind of the industry standard for 2 deep hive bodies, is because that's generally the space that a queen's going to lay. She may wander a little bit up and may put a little bit of brood on the bottom of your top honey super that's right above your brood chamber, but she won't do much more than that. So this is an optional piece of equipment. You do not have to have it. But if you are new to beekeeping and you want to make sure that queen is sequestered to those 2 bottom boxes, this is an option for you. It also makes it easier to find her if you know she's in those 2 boxes, because sometimes she will wander around in boxes that do not, or in hive body stacks that do not incorporate a queen excluder. But it's generally an optional piece of equipment. The next piece that you see here is our honey super. So above our brood chamber is where bees store honey. This is also how, again, like I said, over the winter, that's how they move up to access those resources. This is a natural way that bees orient the colony. Brood below, honey stores above. So this is where your honey is going to be put on. This is where you're going to be harvesting honey from. You don't harvest honey from your brood chambers. You harvest them from your honey supers. And that's where you're going to be harvesting honey from. It's where you're going to be managing a lot of space for the bees as far as honey production is concerned. And in the super, just like in your deep hive bodies, you are going to have your frames as well. And again, 8-10 frame arrangements. We mentioned that the height is 6 5/8 typically for honey supers. They're also known as medium boxes as well. So if you're looking for equipment, they may call them honey supers. They may call them medium hive bodies. It just depends on the manufacturer you're working with. All right, so inside of those hive bodies, you have frames. Now, frames come in lots of different orientations. Some people do not use foundation. I am not one of those folks. And the reason for that is that wax is a very resource-intensive process. The bees actually produce the wax themselves. They have wax glands on the bottom of their abdomen, and they actually produce the sheets of wax themselves and then mold them into the combs. The less work you've got to put on your bees to create that wax, the more energy they can use to do other things. And so some people like foundationless for them to make the full wax themselves, which, again, personal option. I am not one of those folks. I tend to use what's called foundation. And so you have 2 different frames here. You have a wooden frame on the top and you have a plastic frame on the bottom. Some frames you can purchase are all plastic, meaning that the frame itself is plastic and the foundation that the bees build the wax upon. You can see it's already in a template. That's what foundation is really great for, is it gives them a template to build off of. You can see that one has both plastic frame and plastic foundation. The top one you can see is a wooden frame, and I don't use plastic frames. I'm not a big fan of them. They tend to warp over time, and I'm not a big fan of the plastic frames. I have all wooden frames, and I use plastic foundation in my wooden frames. So you can use plastic foundation or wax foundation in wooden frames. Again, totally a personal preference. The big difference is that wax foundation just pops right in, and it's very rigid. So when you do extraction and you're spinning your honey around, that foundation will never come out. Wax foundation is a little bit different. You see on this picture that there are wires that are embedded in the wax, and that's for a reason, because if you were to run that thing through an extractor without those wires embedded, the whole thing would just blow out. I mean, it would create a mess in your extractor. So when you use wax foundation on wooden frames, there is some special equipment you need. Not only do you have those vertical slats that you see that are already incorporated into the foundation itself when you purchase it, but you also need to put vertical slats in there, or horizontal slats in there as well, to create more rigidity in that. And so it requires an ironing device where you iron in those other wires. So a little bit of special equipment. Some people really like to use beeswax foundation. Again, it's a personal choice. I prefer plastic. The thing that you do need to do, though, if you are going to use plastic foundation, is you need to make sure that it is coated in beeswax. Bees will not generally accept just pure plastic foundation very well. It's one of the problems with the flow hive. If you're familiar with that, the flow hive has a proprietary honey super that has these big plastic frames in them that you can extract right from. That plastic, the bees just do not like that as a medium to store honey in or build wax on. So if you are using plastic foundation, you need to make sure that it's either wax coated from the manufacturer, and all manufacturers offer a wax coated option, or you need to get some beeswax and you can use a paintbrush and just paint some beeswax on there. That works really well as well. So different options as far as frames are concerned. To be honest, as long as it's wax coated, the bees aren't going to care. They'll build it on either one of these, whether it's plastic or wax. Okay, the next piece of equipment above our honey super is what's known as an inner cover. Now, the inner cover sits between our honey supers and the outer cover of the hive. And basically what it prevents is it prevents that next piece of equipment, which is our top cover, from getting stuck right to the top of the hive. So as the bees are going through the colony, they propolize everything. It's like glue, and they will glue everything together. So the reason we use an inner cover is so that when you come to the hive and you're getting ready to open it, it doesn't, they haven't glued that top cover right down on top of that, that hive body. So it makes it a little easier for getting in. And so you can open that up, and then you have your inner cover right there. You pop that off, and now you're working in your bees. The other thing that a lot of folks use inner covers for is for top entrances. Top entrances are something that you can run year round. It provides really good air circulation, very important in the winter so that bees don't accumulate a lot of moisture in the hive. You need to have a bottom and a top entrance going into the winter and through the winter. And so a lot of people incorporate this into the inner cover. You can see at the front of the inner cover, there's a notch right there. That's your top entrance. And so you'd have that face down on top of the honey super, and it allows for a top entrance for your bees to come in and out of, and to provide airflow so that there's constant airflow through the colony, which is very important. So the last piece of equipment that we've got here is the telescoping outer cover. Now, the telescoping outer cover, it's the outermost part of the hive, and it's the topmost part. Essentially, all it's doing is it's providing protection from the elements for your bee colonies. Now, there's a couple things kind of to think about here. So number one, there's two different styles of top cover. The telescoping cover gets its name because when we look at the hive bodies themselves, that top hive body actually telescopes into the outer cover. And so you end up with this lip around the outer edge of the outer cover. And that works fine for hobbyists. This typically is a top cover that most hobbyists use. But if you're a commercial beekeeper or a sideliner that has beehives that are on pallets or being moved across the United States or even locally, you want to make sure that those hives can get real close to one another. And so the other option to this is what's called the migratory cover, which is essentially just a piece of wood that goes on top of the hive body. Again, all it's doing is keeping the elements out. Now, the reason that is nice from a commercial aspect is that commercial beekeepers tend to keep their hives on pallets that are 4 or 6 or in arrangement. So there's 4 or 6 hives on a single pallet, and those hives have to be right next to each other. So the big thing that the migratory covers do is it removes that lip that's on the outside of the colony with the telescoping cover. Oops. All right. Okay, so that is our entire Langstroth hive from top to bottom. Those pieces of equipment that comprise the Langstroth hive, you should be familiar with all of them. And again, we've covered the function of each one of those pieces of equipment. So we're going to wrap up today with talking about feeders. That is another important piece of equipment that you need to have as you're getting started in your beekeeping career, because especially in northern climates like northern Michigan and the UP, there are times of the year, invariably, where your bees are going to be working and the weather is not going to be suitable for them to fly. And so during those times, or during times of spring buildup, or even when we're getting into fall and we're trying to put on extra weight for the winter, that's times when we're going to be feeding bees. Now, if you have a package or a nuke that you're starting, you're generally, especially with packages, you're going to be feeding heavy most of the spring. And so you need to be aware of what feeder options are available to you. And we're going to cover the main ones right now. All right, so the first one is the Boardman feeder. This is an entrance feeder. It's sold with a lot of beginning beehive kits that you see available from beekeeping manufacturers. And essentially all it is it's this metal piece that you see here in the bottom, and then there's a mason jar that has holes in it mounted to the top of it. Now, the thing that's nice about this, especially for beginners, and I think this is probably why they incorporate it in these kits, is that it allows you to see how much food these bees are actually going through. And bees they motor through sugar syrup. Even smaller colonies will motor through it. And so like on this picture you see here, the bees are going to go through that in probably a day or so. And so it's not a big reservoir with a quart jar, but it is nice because you can visually see how fast that's happening. And when you're new, it's something that's a little kind of mysterious as to how quickly bees are going to go through this. Now, there's a major problem with the Boardman feeder, and it's one reason why I do not recommend this feeder, and most professional beekeepers would never recommend a Boardman feeder to you. And the reason for that is because it induces a lot of robbing, and you can see that happening on this colony right there. all of these bees, most of these are not part of this colony. In fact, what they're doing, because the Boardman feeder is in the entrance, bees can come in the front of it and just go right around to it. And they don't have to be members of that colony. And they can overrun a colony really quick. And you'll just be attracting robbers all day to your colony. So if you do have one of these, it's not the end all be all. The solution to eliminating that robbing situation with a Boardman feeder is that you actually can just take the whole feeder out, the plate that it's mounted on and the mason jar, and you can put it on top of the hive. Now, when you're feeding bees, having feeders that are inside of the hive is ideal because the only bees that can get to it are the bees that are part of the colony. And so what you would do if you wanted to incorporate this Boardman feeder into your colony is that you would just take off your top cover, take off your inner cover. You would set the Boardman feeder right on top of the top box frames. So the frames are right there. Just set the Boardman feeder right on top of it with the little metal device that you see there that the mason jar sits on. You even don't need the metal device. I just oftentimes will sit mason jars right on top of my frames on my top box. And then what you do is you take another empty box, no frames in it, and you put that over that and then put your top cover on top of that. So your feeders are now enclosed inside of the colony so that no one can rob it out. So there is a way that you can still use the Boardman feeder if you have one. I know a lot of you get these with kits. So that's a solution. But using it on the front entrance is not ideal. It creates a lot of robbing situations. And generally, you're using these on smaller colonies that you're trying to get started. And so that can be a real problem for attracting a lot of robbers. All right, so the next one that we're looking at here is the top feeders. Now, there's many different styles of top feeders. This is one style, but essentially the idea is that this mounts on the top box of your colony, and the bees can get into it, but robbers can't. And so if you look here in the middle of the left picture, you can see there's an opening, and that opening is open to the bottom the box below it. And so the bees come up through that opening, and then those floaters that you see in there, those are what the bees crawl on. Bees are terrible swimmers, and so you need to have something for them to crawl on with these types of feeders. Lots of them will incorporate metal mesh. Some of them incorporate these lattices like you see here, but you got to have something for your bees to crawl on. Now, the advantage of this is, one, it's enclosed in the colony because you're going to put your top cover right on top of this. But two, the reservoir capacity is much higher for these. So typically these will hold about 2 or 3 gallons of sugar syrup. That's a lot of feed. That will get you through a week or two on a good colony. So it's much more convenient as well because it has a larger holding capacity. The next one that we have here is the frame feeder, or division board feeder is another name it's known by. And the division board feeder or the frame feeder, it replaces one or two of the outside frames, depending on which style you purchase. They come in many different styles. You can find them for medium boxes and deep boxes. And essentially you put it on the outside of your colony on one side, and you fill it full of sugar syrup. This reservoir tends to be about 2 gallons. And then you have this kind of top here that has this ladder system that you see on the right picture. That ladder system, so the bees go in through those holes on the top, and then they climb on the ladder down to the sugar syrup. Again, bees are terrible swimmers, so you got to give them something to climb on. These work very good, and they are very inexpensive. And so if you have not bought feeders yet, this is a great option. Widely used in the commercial industry because essentially you just open the box and you just can fill it right up. So very convenient as well. Now, if you're a do-it-yourselfer, maybe you just want to make your own feeders. You can also make top feeders as bucket feeders, we call these. Bucket feeders can be all sorts of different things. I've seen people use ice cream buckets. I've seen people use 2-gallon paint buckets. I've seen all sorts of different arrangements for bucket feeders. You can purchase them as well. They tend to be about 1 gallon or 2 in capacity. The big thing with bucket feeders, though, is that this is a gravity-fed feeder, and so it has to hold vacuum. And that's really important because you're putting this on top of your colony, and you see it in 2 different arrangements here. So this is on top of the inner cover, and you would put a box around this, and again, a lid on top of that. It basically just creates a nice space for the bees to be able to, so that it's not right down on the frames. You see this other one here that the box is around, and they've got a couple pieces of wood that go across to kind of elevate it a little bit. But the big thing, if you're going to make any of these, and even if you're using one that's manufactured, is that you have to make sure it holds vacuum. And what I mean is you need to fill it up with sugar syrup. When you flip it over, it's going to drip out a little bit for maybe a minute or so, but then it should stop. and it should hold vacuum so that that stuff doesn't continue to come out. If it does not hold vacuum, or if it loses vacuum over time, those 1 or 2 gallon of feed is going to be right on top of your colony, and it is going to make a mess of your hive equipment. So it's just, you got to, they work really well, but you got to make sure they hold vacuum. The nice thing is, again, I said you can make these yourself. Experiment though, because the larger capacity you have, the more head pressure you have pushing down on that liquid, and the easier things are going to be able to come out. You may lose vacuum quicker. So what I generally tell people to do is, if you have a 2 gallon feeder, start with a 1/16 drill bit. Start with 5 holes, flip it over, see if it works, add a couple more holes, flip it over, see if it works. And eventually you're going to get to a point where it doesn't hold vacuum. And then that's going to give you an idea of how many holes you need, and with whatever capacity you're using. But again, you can purchase these as well. They're not very expensive. All right, so the last thing I'm going to mention in today's lecture is what I kind of mentioned at the top of the lecture, which is we are only going to be covering Langstroth hives in this course. And there is a good reason for that. Langstroth hives, although they are industry standard in North America, both in the hobbyist sideliner and even the commercial industry, the reason that we are only teaching you on that here today, and I've been beekeeping for 15 years, I've been farming for nearly 30. I've been around bees a lot of my life. And what I have seen in northern climates, particularly here in Michigan, is that folks are nobody starts beekeeping to kill bees. But you have to understand that the climate has a big impact on what you can keep bees in. If you live in temperate climates like Florida, the lower states, southern states, western states, a long hive, like you see pictured on the side here, a horizontal hive, will work just fine. And the reason is because you only have maybe 4 or 8 weeks of winter. And a lot of times in those climates, you don't get snow, you don't get any of that. And so bees are kind of always around. Usually winter in those areas means that there's just not a lot of forage available. I'm originally from California, and that's where I started beekeeping, was on the central coast of California. We did not have winter. It's pretty much 60 to 80 degrees year round. The only thing we had was about a 5-week period around December where nothing was blooming. And so we could get away with doing a long hive, horizontal hive, because if it was only a few weeks where they didn't have food, and that's okay because they're not going to need to be moving around the colony very much for food. It goes for the same with the southern states. We are not in those states. If you live in the UP or northern Michigan, you're talking 4 to 6 months of winter. That means no food available. And so you have to understand the way that bees work behaviorally. Bees use gravity to move up. They're what's called gravitropism. They have an ability to detect gravity, and they have over time evolved to position food resources above them, and the cluster moves up over the winter. It does not move. It may move a little bit horizontally, but it's not going to move 10 frames over horizontally to get to your food resources that may be in a long hive. And so the Langstroth hive, the reason it's so successful for us in northern climates, and this goes for us in the UP, but also in Canada, where they have much harsher winters than us. The reason this is industry standard is because the way the hive is designed mimics nature, meaning that wild bees would be in a tree, and the tree is oriented in a vertical fashion, not in a horizontal fashion. And so they are predisposed from an evolutionary standpoint to store honey resources above the brood. And as winter hits, they cluster tightly and they move as a cluster up in the hive over the course of winter. And so that is why long hives tend to be not successful in our climates. You may run into somebody that gets a couple hives through every few years or so, but in large, I have never in my career, both working professionally and for universities as a beekeeping educator, I have never in my career met a very successful person in northern climates using any sort of long hive. I have never met that person. And if you know somebody, I'd love to meet them. But I'm talking somebody that has less than 15% losses annually. That's what we can accomplish with a Langstroth hive. I have never seen a long hive beekeeper that can get those loss rates down that low in northern climates. And it's because the hive is just not designed for what we live in, which is 4 to 6 months of solid winter. The other hives that you see pictured here, the one on the left, Ware hives, there's all sorts of different hives. Ware hives tend to be a little, they are oriented correctly, but it's more of a kind of a natural comb building process in those. So they're a little tougher to work with when it comes to extraction. But what you see in the middle, the Langstroth hive, is the industry standard. I would highly recommend that is what you go with. Now, other alternative hives, the flow hive is a very popular hive with new beekeepers. I would definitely not recommend you purchase one. Every beekeeper I have worked with, and I've worked with hundreds that have purchased these hives, they're very expensive. Every beekeeper I've worked with has ditched that hive at some point. But what you need to understand is the flow hive is a Langstroth hive. It is, the only difference is the box on the top that you extract the honey from, that is the difference. It's a proprietary extraction box. And from my personal experience, when these first came out, I was given a couple of these to try out. They do not work. I mean, if basically what I mean by they don't work is the bees just don't readily want to store honey in that proprietary super because of the material that's made out of it. It's not wax, it's just plastic. And the bees just, plastic is not a substrate that they tend to like to store honey in. If forced to absolutely, that's the only place they can store it, they will do it. But it's not the acceptance process is not readily available. I mean, it takes some work to get them to accept those colonies. So that is why we are teaching you on the Langstroth hive. Like I said, I've been beekeeping a long time. Our overwintering rates here in the UP for the last 4 years, which, that's how long we've been up in the UP. We were in Lansing prior to that. We have lost in our 4 years of being here, we've essentially had overwintering losses of less than 5%. And so that means that we're losing, out of our apiary, out of about 50 colonies is what we generally are running year to year. We might lose a couple beehives, but they're all Langstroth hives. And I can tell you from my experience and the experience of my colleagues from other universities all around the country in northern climates, this is what's going to give you success. So just keep that in mind. And that's why this is what we're going to be training you on. All right, with that, I'm going to say thank you for joining me for this lecture, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next one.